All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely. Always up for a good deep dive.
Well, today's going to be a heavy one, but important, obviously. Disability,
Hmm.
intimate partner violence, and all within this crazy landscape of global migration.
You know, what's interesting to me, we often look at these issues kind of separately, right?
Yeah,
The sources we have for this dive, they show some pretty surprising links between them.
yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's jump right in. We have this DHS study on disability and IPV. It paints a pretty grim picture of what women with disabilities are up against.
Right. And you know what's really concerning is it goes beyond just saying, hey, women with disabilities experience higher rates of IPV. It tries to dig into the why, like power dynamics, especially when partner is also the caregiver.
Oh, wow, yeah. You're right. That creates like this double vulnerability.
Yeah.
Makes it that much harder to get help.
Exactly. And some of the numbers from the studies they highlight are really disturbing. Like women with disabilities reporting higher percentages of emotional abuse compared to women without disabilities.
Yeah, and when you look at sexual assault, it's even worse. The report says women with disabilities were 4 times more likely to experience it.
Yeah, 4 times. Well, it's pretty alarming.
It really underscores the need for, I mean, we need better support services, right?
Hmm.
Services that are specifically designed for these unique vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. And to the report's credit, they try to take a more sensitive approach to gathering data using those Washington group questions.
Right. Those are designed to be more disability sensitive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Though even they admit that getting accurate data is tough because, there's so much stigma around both disability and IPV. It creates this culture of silence that's hard to break.
It makes you realize we need research that goes beyond just the numbers.
Hmm.
We need to understand the lived experiences of these women.
100%. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, let's talk global migration. That OECD International Migration Outlook, the one for 2024, it's like a snapshot of a world that's constantly on the move.
And of course, we can't ignore huge events like the war in Ukraine. I mean, it's completely reshaped like everything.
It really has. We're seeing record levels of both permanent and temporary migration. Actually, refugee resettlement in those OECD countries, it's hit a new high since 2016.
Wow, that's huge. But I have a feeling there's more to it than just those overall numbers, right?
Yeah, you always have to look deeper, right? For example, this Lowy Institute article, they point out some inconsistencies in Australian aid. Specifically, they're kind of critical of Australia's support for this new Asia-Pacific pooled fund. They'd rather see more support going to already existing funds in Latin America and Africa.
Interesting. So they're basically questioning how strategically aid is being used,
Yeah.
especially with these issues being, well, global.
Exactly. It's not just about how much aid, but where it goes. Speaking of needs, that report, The Journey Ahead, it takes a deep dive into, well, all the challenges low-skilled migrants face.
I mean, they're the ones hit hardest by economic shocks, right?
Yeah, and they often lack access to social safety nets, which makes everything so much more precarious.
Definitely. But there were some glimmers of hope in that report, right?
Oh, absolutely. They highlight some really promising initiatives like humanitarian parole in the U.S. and those safe mobility offices they have down Latin America. They're trying to get people safer, legal ways to migrate.
Right, because the alternative is often those dangerous, irregular routes.
Hmm.
And you know what else caught my eye? The role of technology in managing all this.
Yeah, it's a growing trend.
Yeah.
That report even mentioned the success of, what was it called? Meta's high-resolution population density maps?
Oh, yeah, there's that OCHA impact story about them.
Yeah.
Those AI-powered maps, they estimate population density and demographics. And it actually helped organizations like World Vision, help them deliver services better.
Yeah. It shows how data and tech can really make a difference, like a real on-the-ground impact.
It's cool when you see it being used that way, but of course, there's always that question of access and potential misuse.
Of course. And it's funny, that whole conversation about pooled funds for humanitarian aid, the
Yeah.
Lowy Institute, they want a more holistic approach,
Yeah.
especially with climate change, being such a threat.
Makes sense. And they bring up a really important point about making sure we consider gender dynamics when we're talking about disaster risk management. Okay, so this is a good point to transition, I think, because all of this ties into the next part of our deep dive, where we really start to see how these threads connect.
Yeah, let's dive into that intersection. We should start with that IASC policy on protection of internally displaced persons. It's a pretty key document, outlines the rights and needs of IDPs.
Yeah, and one thing that really stuck out to me was that emphasis on participation. Like IDPs, they need to have a say in decisions that directly affect their lives.
Right. It can't be top down. It has to be collaborative.
Exactly. And that actually connects really well with the challenges highlighted in that report on women's leadership and climate resilience in Afghanistan, the one called Embracing Knowledge and Expertise.
Oh, interesting. I haven't dug into that one too deeply yet.
Yeah, it basically stresses that those top-down strategies, they often fail in complex situations,
Hmm.
especially when it comes to empowering local
I
communities.
can see that. So what's their solution? What do they recommend?
A more localized approach,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to women. They highlight these amazing personal stories of women like, let me see, I think it was Zeba and Miriam. They're working within their communities, advocating for women's rights and climate resilience.
That's powerful. Real grassroots change.
Yeah, and there's this emphasis on the role of religious leaders in helping women participate. Shows how important it is to engage with the existing social structures.
Yeah, if you want real change, you have to work within the system, right? Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of, well, the first part of our deep dive. We've
Yeah.
covered a lot of ground.
We have. And up next, we're going to get into how technology is changing, well, literally everything about migration. And then we'll explore what meaningful empowerment really looks like in these different situations.
So, picking up on that tech thread, that OECD report, it dives into some really interesting ways tech is being used in migration management.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? Like they talk about how countries are using more and more digital tools, streamlining visa applications,
Mm-hmm.
you know, tracking flows of people, even assessing migrant skills. It's wild.
What's exciting to me is how these tools could make the whole migration process like way more efficient and transparent. For migrants and governments, imagine like applying for a visa online, super easy. Migrants having clear info about their rates, their options.
Right, that would be huge.
Yeah.
Especially for the most vulnerable people who always seem to face the most red tape. But of course, anytime you bring in tech, you got to think about the ethical side.
Exactly. The report's really clear about that, like the potential for algorithms to be biased, and how we have to protect privacy, keep data secure. Using this tech responsibly, ethically, it's paramount.
It is. It's such a tightrope walk, using tech for good
Yeah.
while making sure it doesn't make existing inequalities worse.
It really is. And this kind of brings us back to that discussion about disability and IPV. Remember how the DHS report stressed being sensitive with data collection, protecting survivors' privacy?
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that data, powerful as it is, can also be misused.
Yeah.
We always have to think about the consequences and put the safety of the most vulnerable first.
Couldn't agree more. And it all points to this bigger theme that runs through all our sources, right? Collaboration, whether we're tackling IPV, supporting migrants, or trying to build resilience to climate change, none of us can do it alone.
It's so true. And that IASC policy on IDP is a perfect example of that. All about partnerships between humanitarian organizations, governments, and most importantly, local communities.
It takes a village, right?
Yeah.
And that same collaborative spirit comes up in that report about women's leadership in Afghanistan, too.
Yeah, they really hammered home that point. Partnerships between international groups, government agencies, but especially local women's groups. Bringing all these different perspectives, experiences to the table, that's how you make solutions that actually work, solutions that last.
It makes you realize the people who are closest to these challenges, they often have the best insights, right? They're the ones who should be driving change, not just receiving help, but leading the way.
Totally. And that local ownership thing. It's a big part of the Lowy Institute's critique of Australian aid, too, right? They argue that even with pooled funds, you got to make sure they're backing initiatives led by the locals, not taking away their control.
Exactly. It all comes down to making sure aid is actually responding to what communities need and want, not driven by some outside agenda.
Right. It's about letting communities decide what's best for them. Okay, so this feels like a good place to pause and ask the big question. What does empowerment, like real, meaningful empowerment, actually look like in all these situations?
That is the question, isn't it? I mean, is it about money? Legal pathways, shifting who has the power.
Probably all of the above, and then some. Creating a world where people, communities, they have the power to make their own choices,
Oh.
to shape their own future.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it reminds me, this deep dive, it's not just about understanding the problems, it's about figuring out how to create a world that's more just, more equitable for everyone.
Absolutely. And I think part of that is challenging our own assumptions. Like the DHS report reminds us that disability often gets overlooked in discussions of IPV. And that report about women's leadership in Afghanistan Makes you rethink what power and influence really mean.
Right. We need to be more inclusive, more open to different ways of thinking, different experiences.
And we have to be willing to listen, to learn from people whose lives might be completely different from our own.
I think those are pretty good takeaways as we move forward.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've gone through a lot today, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
No, we have. And it's kind of fitting that the sources have brought us to this point, this place where we have to grapple with all these issues, these seemingly separate issues, all intersecting.
Because at the end of the day, it's all part of the human experience, right?
Yeah, no
Like,
questions.
yeah.
These issues are all like intertwined. And you can't ignore the bigger picture, right? We're talking about climate change, conflict, inequality. I mean, it's a lot.
And it's the people who are already most vulnerable, women with disabilities, migrants, those in really fragile situations. They're hit the hardest.
Yeah, it can be kind of overwhelming to think about. But I think it's helpful to remember what we saw in those sources, right? All that emphasis on human resilience and how there are solutions out there. That's so true. Like the stories of those women in Afghanistan, Ziba and Mariam. I mean, talk about resilience. They're facing so many challenges, but they're still taking action, making a difference. It's inspiring.
It is. And then you have those meta-population maps in Rwanda. It's like a perfect example of tech being used for good, actually making a positive impact.
Exactly. It's about using data and innovation to get at the root of the problem. Not just putting a Band-Aid on things, but empowering people to actually thrive.
Right. But it's not all about tech, is it? There's this whole other piece about changing how we think, changing the systems that keep inequality going.
That's where the IASC policy comes in, I think. It's calling for a completely different approach to humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, it's about moving away from that old top-down model and really prioritizing participation and local ownership. Let communities take the lead.
And that report on women's leadership in Afghanistan, they're saying the same thing, right? We have to challenge those traditional gender roles, create spaces where women can lead, where their voices are heard.
Absolutely. These are tough challenges, no doubt. But if we want a better future, we have to tackle them head on.
No question. And I think this deep dive has really brought us back to that core idea. The idea agency, giving people the power to make their own choices, control their own lives.
It really has. And as we wrap up, I think it's important to remember this conversation doesn't end here.
Yeah.
It's up to each of us to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a world where everyone has the chance to live a good life, a life with dignity.
That's a great point. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about staying engaged, staying curious.
Exactly. Well, on that note, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Hope you found it, well, insightful, I guess, and maybe even a little bit hopeful.
I think hope is essential, right?
Yeah.
We have to believe that things can get better. And remember, each of us has the power to help make that happen.